Now let's look at the second big moment in this kingdom's saga, the fall, our rebellion against God. It would be great if we lived in the world of Proverbs, but in the Bible, Ecclesiastes comes after Proverbs because of the severe limits of a creational ethic. And one of the big reasons for those limits, not the only one, but a big one, is the next big moment in this kingdom's story, the fall. This is moment number 2 in the kingdom's epic history, rebellion, the so-called fall of the whole world into helpless alienation and depravity. In Genesis 3, the man and woman in the garden depose God as king, or at least they try, and rejecting God as king is a theme that's going to play out across the kingdom's narrative. In 1 Samuel 8, when the Israelites complain to Samuel and say, "We want a king like all the other nations have kings. Why don't we have one of those?" Samuel asks the Lord, and the Lord says, "They haven't rejected you as king, Samuel. They've rejected me as king, and they've been doing it ever since I brought them out of Egypt." Well, in Genesis 3 is when we start doing it. It's a lot earlier than the Exodus. The story of the Garden of Eden is so well known that a lot of assumptions about what it means and what it involved have crept into our subconscious and sometimes our consciousness. First, there's an assumption that Eden had been a life of painless, immortal leisure, an endless vacation where you could just reach up and grab some fruit. Well, signs point in different directions. Obviously, it's a place of plenty compared to what Adam and Eve face after the fall. And since working ourselves to death is one of the consequences of our rebellion, it makes a certain amount of sense to envision what we left behind as one where we didn't have to work at all. Well, there are signs pointing in the opposite direction. It says in Genesis 2 that there was no one to till or tend the soil, so God made humanity from the ground, and there was no suitable helper, so God divided the human being into male and female. That means there was work to be done. It might not have had the same edge that it did after the fall, but there was work to be done. Also, I'm not sure that life in Eden would have been painless. If Adam had stubbed his toe on a rock, it probably would have hurt. Nervous systems aren't just there as consequences for sin. They're part of organic, bodily, human existence. On the other hand, the man and the woman are well supplied for. So Eden to me feels like a head start. It feels like the kind of nurturing environment God provided his human beings in which they could grow up, the way a good parent provides a household that fosters the growth of their children to adulthood. Another assumption to question, were Adam and Eve perfect? Well, obviously not, because they fell for a snake's trick, and they were probably doing so willingly. Saints who have been sanctified, who have been at least moved toward perfection, are much more resilient and even anti-fragile, to use a phrase from Nicholas Taleb, meaning that adversity actually strengthens human beings. Well, adversity strengthens the saints too. Paul says it in Romans 5. Suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character yields hope because of the Holy Spirit given to us. That looks more like perfection than the little glimmer of pre-fall life that you get in Genesis 2 and 3. Adam and Eve might have been good, but they don't seem to have been finished. They aren't ready. While we like to think of Eden as perfection and the fall as a fall from perfection, and therefore ethics becomes a way of coping with that imperfection, that consequence of sin. Here's a question. Would children need raising? There are already families in view in Genesis 2, when after Eve is made from the side of Adam, it says, "This is why a man leaves his father and mother and joins to his wife, and they become one flesh." They have fathers and mothers in mind, which means they have children in mind, which means family life is in mind. It's not just a consequence of the fall, it's part of the plan. So if children are part of the plan, do children need raising? Do they need ethics? Do they need formation? Well, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't human beings need training and shaping and formation with or without sin? Sin obviously makes the process more difficult and presents further challenges and further reasons for us to be shaped and trained. But I don't think it provides the entire rationale for why human beings need discipline, and that means ethics. Were there moral challenges in Eden, in this good place before sin? Obviously, the snake is a moral challenge. In fact, the snake's words land on fertile soil. The man and woman already seem to be facing moral challenges within their own imaginations, for reasons I don't have time to go into. The snake is not the only challenge. Trust in God is a moral challenge for them, clearly. So virtues, strengthening our character and helping us resist and overcome these challenges, those have a role apart from a response to sin. Virtues like courage, patient endurance. In raising families, you need to have patient endurance to raise children who are going to grow up and leave and break their hearts, even if they're wonderful children. Virtues of the kind that we call emotional intelligence nowadays, the capacity to trust, and work ethics all pertain to a life with sin or without sin. So there's room to broaden our understanding of ethics and the challenges of goodness beyond just as a remedy for sin. And there are reasons to treat creational ethics as relevant with or without sin, apart from the matter of the fact that we've rebelled and entered ourselves in a bad situation. Our sinful rebellion is obviously against God. In fact, it's primarily against God, even if it also works against one another and against the rest of God's creation. And it's contrary to God's purposes, which by this point in the story have barely been disclosed. We really have only a hint of what God might be up to. But even if that act is mainly against God, it carries far-reaching consequences for the whole cosmos, as we find out in the next few chapters, for human relationships and structures, and for our own persons. We've been granted a unique relationship with God, unique relationships with one another, and with all creation, as the stewards that God has granted the privilege of helping him develop his earth. Sin also disorders the relationship with the social structures, not just personal relationships, but the kinds of structured relationships that human beings depend on just because of the kind of species we are. And with our own selves, our own inner beings are disordered and disrupted by sin. I mentioned Jonathan Haidt's image of a rider on an elephant. He says that's a human person. The elephant is our instincts, our inclinations, our moral sense, and our rider is our intellect, which doesn't have a lot of power. It actually imagines it has more. Well, sin disrupts even that relationship. In fact, it disrupts the elephant and the passions get out of kilter, and it disrupts the rider. Our intellect gets disordered, our wills are disordered, and we get inclined to pursue what's wrong rather than what's right. Eden was a great start towards a goal which hasn't been revealed yet, but which is a good one. And that great start through our rebellion has been misdirected. And now creation itself has been hijacked, and it has to wait in frustrated pointlessness while we move things in the wrong direction, precisely the wrong direction from the one God intended. Genesis 2 presents us in a great situation, a great start for a beautiful future. And what had been a great start towards a good but not really well-revealed goal has now been misdirected. Here's a chart that represents the good potential of old creation in yellow and the realization of that in green. That's the telos, or the goal that God has in store for us. We don't see it yet in Genesis, but we do see it in Jesus Christ. Eternal futures of exaltation with him, of life, eternal and abundant life, and of fruitfulness. Creatures that keep on creating, useful, honorable. Well, in rebellion, we misdirect ourselves and we misdirect God's good creation and misdirect ourselves and creation. Creation, having been hijacked by these rebellious human wills, now has to wait and be abused in frustrated pointlessness, the pointlessness of death, of dispossession, and of fruitlessness, and the dispersion and the disposal that all brings. The opposite of exaltation is dispossession. It's shame. It's being removed from responsibility. And that's what the fall does. We misdirect creation, and instead of earning exaltation, we earn wages of dispossession. God intended life. In fact, there's a tree of life in the garden to provide it. In abusing God's good creation, in eating the forbidden fruit, we have earned the consequences of death and the grave. The presence of the tree of life demonstrates that that is not what God had intended or does finally intend. And finally, the opposite of fruitfulness is fruitlessness, uselessness, While we were made to be fruitful, till the soil, perfect God's creation, and perfect ourselves in the process, all in a good relationship with God. Instead, our rebellion has made us useless, worse than useless. Well, the consequence of being fruitless or useless is you lose your job, you get fired. So fallen human sinners reap the wages of dispersal. We are dismissed. We are banished from Eden, and later in chapter 11, human beings are scattered across the earth. Needless to say, that was not the goal. It's never been the goal. God will find a way to get to that goal, but it's going to have to be a different way than just the short, obvious way of obedience and faith. It's going to be the long way of redemption, atonement, remaking, not just of ourselves, but of our relationships and all creation. I mentioned that life in Eden was challenging, and obviously we failed to rise to that challenge. The challenges of sinless life are now overcome and entangled in the challenges of evil, sinful life. Philosophers use one term for the natural challenges of a not always hospitable world. They call that natural evil. Evil means something a lot broader than we take it in English to mean now. Let's call it natural badness. If you try to live in the middle of a desert, you will find it's a bad place to live. If you try to live on the top of Mount Everest, you'll find it's a bad place to live. If you try to live in the middle of the sea, that's a bad place for human beings. It's a great place for fish, though. Well, most of creation is inhospitable to us. Even most of Earth is inhospitable to us. And it has some sharp edges. It has features like earthquakes, volcanoes, droughts, and all the rest. Those are called natural evil. They aren't sin, and they aren't necessarily bad. They are part of the features of a good creation that isn't always hospitable to the lives that human beings would like. Well, sin is a different kind of badness. It's moral evil. It's what in English we usually mean when we say evil. Sin's moral badness now supplements the badness of aspects of the natural world, which is still good, and doesn't just supplement them, doesn't just raise new challenges alongside the old one. Moral evil now entangles and captures natural evil. Death doesn't just become a moment between our organic life and the glorified life of our risen, eternal human lives. Now, death is an enemy. Death is a separator. Parenting children isn't just a challenge. Parenting children is now treacherous business because it brings out the darkness in us and it translates that darkness from us to our children. Sin complicates matters for creational ethics because even if we need creational ethics for ordinary and good features of human life, raising children, now, because of moral evil, because of sin characterizing our thoughts, our relationships, ourselves, our cosmos in some sense, now even those naturally good challenges get brought into evil's purview and become curses. Paul talks that way about the Torah. Now, the Torah is not bad. He says it's holy and it's just and it's good, but sin finds the Torah to be a hospitable tool for intensifying itself and bringing death and condemnation. That's a way moral evil can co-opt good things, whether they are natural forces or supernatural things like the Torah, the covenant of Moses that God made with us. Genesis 3 describes the originating sin in the garden and some of the first consequences of that action. Genesis 4 through 11, the rest of Genesis's primordial narratives, display the consequences of sin in this catastrophic unfolding trajectory of primordial human history. It is a sight to see. These chapters in Genesis give us genealogies, stories of generations of human beings, interlaced with stories of horrible violence. Genesis says the earth was filled with violence. The exercise, and sometimes wrongful exercise, of superhuman power, as in Genesis 6, when the so-called sons of God mate with the daughters of human beings. In between those generations are judgments. Our judgments on one another, usually unjust, and God's judgments on individuals and even the whole human race. Genesis 4 to 11 displays disrespect, our disrespect for one another, our disrespect for God, both individually and collectively as a whole human race, in the story of the Tower of Babel, where human beings conspire to make a name for ourselves by building a tower that will allow us to storm heaven. And that brings the consequence of confusion and dispersion. where God takes away human capacities to cooperate, so that even if we keep conspiring against him, we'll also be conspiring against each other and sort of canceling each other out, mitigating one another's evil by friction, you might say. I mentioned this odd passage in Genesis 6 about the sons of God, angels maybe. This is a demonstration that the problem of sin is not confined to human beings, even if it starts with human beings, and that's how the story reads in Genesis 3. It spreads. Sin contaminates even superhuman powers, powers above. Paul reflects this really nicely when he describes the way that the structures of the heavenly places, the structures of authority by which we live, need his reminding of the good news of Jesus Christ, because they have transgressed their boundaries. Powers and principalities structure human life and structure the whole creation. And those, somehow, in some mysterious way, are caught up in the moral evil that we have spawned in our rebellion. So even though human beings depend on these structures, the Greek word is stoicheia, the elements, even though these things structure human life and we depend on them, nevertheless, they're broken and they enslave us, enslave all nations. That's the bad news of Genesis 11. These are odd chapters. These are among the oddest chapters in the Bible, and even Old Testament scholars can have a hard time knowing exactly how to interpret them, whether interpret them literally or figuratively or even mythologically. However you choose to interpret them, they tell a story pretty clearly. And that is that human rebellion has left us in an unsolvable mess. The stories in these chapters draw a stark contrast. On the one hand, we have God and God's purposes behind his creation. They were good. It was all very good. Things were ready to get underway. Now those purposes seem to lie in ruins and remote, and the God behind them is remote, and God's will is remote to us. In fact, it's the other way around. We are now remote. We have removed ourselves from God's purposes and been removed as a consequence. And now we live as renegades with our own purposes, our own teleologies, and with dysteleologies, which is a fancy word for aimlessness, pointlessness, goallessness. A line from Blaise Pascal puts it rather well. He said, "Man is neither angel nor beast, and unhappily, whoever wants to act the angel acts the beast." Genesis 1 to 11 is full of wild beasts, and not a few angels as well, and human beings had occupied our own position. And Pascal is right. Now it's as if we can't occupy the position that we were made for. We have to descend too low, below where God wanted us, or try to ascend too high, or at least ascend in wrong ways, and to heights that we are not prepared for.